So I'm very sorry about this, but I will just continue without the presentation view so that at least you can still see some of the slides, especially also later for the examples that I will be showing. So what is the actual problem? Let's start with looking at what online hate speech and what misinformation actually is. So I think you will know this already, and I think we can all agree that currently the online spread of hate speech and misinformation is one of the biggest challenges we are facing right now, especially given the current political and international climate. So that I have a quote here from the Center for Countering Digital Hate that I briefly just want to read out. It says, digital spaces, forming an important new plane of human existence, have been colonized and their unique dynamics exploited by fringe movements that instrumentalize hate and misinformation. These movements are opportunistic, agile, and confident in exerting influence and persuading people. So I think also in recent years, we have seen that the constant spread of hate speech and misinformation is increasing the potential radicalization of people and kind of like vulnerable people being sucked into extremist ideologies and ideas, increasing this problem even further. And according to a relatively recent study by the Alan Turing Institute, about 30 to 40% of people in the UK say about themselves that they have witnessed harmful content, and up to 20% actually say that they have personally experienced abuse online. And there have also been studies about how online hate speech actually affects us offline in our real lives. And there have been a plethora of different studies that have identified correlations between online hate speech and offline violence. And we can see that also in the numbers, for example, in the US and the UK, hate crime numbers have increased noticeably in recent years and in other countries around the world as well. But apart from actual concrete violence being the result of online hate speech, we can also see the traumatic psychological consequences, especially for victims of online abuse. So what actually is harmful or dangerous content? I will be using probably these two terms interchangeably throughout the talk. So harmful content can be understood or defined as any kind of content, be it text, images, or videos, or a combination of those, that has the potential to incite violence or aggression against another person or group of people. And in the context of hate speech, this specifically is related to violence or aggression against people based on specific characteristics, such as religion, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, age, disability, and others. Misinformation and disinformation are maybe a bit clearer in their definition and understanding. I think the key distinction here is the element of intention. So both define the spreading of false information or sharing of false information, but whereas misinformation is kind of the accidental spreading of false information, disinformation is based on an actual intention to spread false information and intention to cause harm. And then there's malinformation, which is quite interesting as well, which basically defines the sharing of what is genuine information, but sharing it in a different context that it actually does cause harm. And I think we've seen a lot of these examples during the pandemic where quite a number of times correct numbers in relation to the spreading of the virus, they have been taken out of context by different groups of people and put in a new context where suddenly the numbers were wrong and they were also potentially dangerous in the kind of message that they were sending. So what is the current approach that social media companies and governments are basically taking to tackle online hate speech and misinformation? And this is basically content moderation, which is primarily a very reactive approach. So the harmful content still makes it onto the social media site and then has to be reported by users. And once it is reported, it will be moderated and then possibly, if the content violates company internal guidelines and policies, it might be deleted or it might actually stay on the platform. And in most extreme cases, a user might be blocked. Yes, so this is in itself already a problem because, as I said, it is reactive and it kind of entails that the harm is already done. People have already seen the harmful content, so that is the first problem. The second problem revolves around human content moderation, but because large parts of this content, because it is often so nuanced and algorithms do not pick everything up perfectly, as we can see, a lot of this content still makes it onto the platform. So this content is still largely moderated by humans, and there have been several really useful publications, such as by Sarah T. Roberts, who wrote the book Behind the Screen, which was published in 2019, that kind of reveals this whole industry of human content moderation and the rather unethical sides of what this kind of work involves. So there are basically two elements here that are problematic about this current approach. That is, on the one hand, the reactive element of it, and on the other hand, the harm that is also done to the human moderators. And then recently, in last October, we've also, of course, seen the different documents that were revealed by the Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen. And in one of these documents, it said that we estimate that we may action as little as 3 to 5% of hate at Facebook, despite being the best in the world at it. And Frances Haugen herself also stated that Facebook would rather kind of prioritize their profit than really work harder on protecting people from harmful content. And so there isn't really very much done from the perspective of these social media companies. And especially in the current context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, again, the Center for Countering Digital Hate found out that Facebook actually failed to label 91% of posts that contained Russian propaganda about Ukraine, which of course, in this context, only leads to further escalation. Okay, before I go into detail about counterspeech and kind of what that looks like and what the benefits are, I want to just briefly mention a few other approaches or a few other suggestions that have been made by different people to kind of approach the problem of online hate speech and harmful content without resorting to censorship. One of the examples or one of the suggestions is what is called nudging. And this kind of is based on the idea that we would add additional buttons to social media platforms and applications that essentially allow people to upvote or downvote a specific comment. So there will be options like buttons saying funny or insightful, or maybe also harmful or not useful. And I guess this is similar to the like and dislike function that we already have on certain social media sites. But this would be a bit more specific even, and kind of a tool to flag certain comments to signal people you still made a useful contribution, even though you may have been subjected to hateful responses. Another suggestion is style transfer. So this is basically software that when you write a text, kind of makes suggestions or edits your text to make it more positive, more polite, less harmful, if you will. And then another approach by a colleague of mine, Marcus Tomlin, and myself, is quarantining hate speech. We published a paper in 2019 about this, where we kind of suggest that a potentially hateful comment would be immediately put into a kind of quarantine. So this is similar to quarantining computer viruses, or maybe your spam filter in your email account. So a user would not immediately see potentially harmful content, and this can be used as an app, as a browser extension. So of course you would have to use it yourself, but you will be able to potentially protect yourself. And then you might be given, or you will be given, a kind of percentage by the system as to how sure it is that something is potentially harmful. So the system may tell you, like, this is 90%, like, I'm 90% sure that this is hate speech. Do you want to see this post? And you then have the option to say no. So this kind of bridges this gap, I suppose, between censorship and still protecting free speech, but also kind of giving a bit more control back to the user, and kind of avoiding this initial harm that is being done by just having anything appear on a social media website. And then, of course, there have been certain suggestions in the legal field. There have been different regulations and laws in a certain number of countries. I guess the most prominent being the Network Enforcement Act that was implemented in Germany in 2017, and has, I think last year it was further strengthened. So it basically forces social media companies to react within 24 hours to a post and take it down if it has been reported. Otherwise, they will be issued a fine. And there have been other laws in France and South Africa, and most recently in Japan. And I guess in a more UK sort of context, I guess we've been talking about the online harms paper for quite a while now, and this has just been released in spring this year. But I also want to point out that there are a number of voices from the legal field that are kind of skeptical with regard to this, and are specifically against legal regulation of hate speech. So I've put together a couple of quotes, or a few quotes, by Nadine Strossen and Ken Stern, both of whom are lawyers and have done quite a bit of work on specifically the issue of hate speech and how to deal with that from a legal perspective. And first of all, both agree that there is no such thing from a legal perspective as hate speech. So there is, of course, speech that we might not find very agreeable, we might find offensive, but that is still within what is tolerated under the label of freedom of speech. And particularly Nadine Strossen also points out that hate speech, the label, tends to often get abused, especially in a political context, to kind of stigmatize and suppress opposing voices, and to kind of, whenever someone says something that you don't agree with, it tends to be labeled as hate speech, and as an attempt to kind of demonize it. And of course, that is also something to keep in mind. Yeah, and both basically agree also with regard to what could be effective, or what is the most useful approach to combating hate speech, different forms of hate speech, and that is basically counter speech. So what is counter speech then? I want to basically start with this quotation because I found this really useful by one of the collective counter speech groups that I will be talking a bit more about later. So I'll just read out the quote, which says, "Do you think about what you ought to say or what you wish others would say when you read the comment fields in social media? Would you dare to share your opinion more frequently if you knew that others in the same thread supported you? Are you already taking action to disrupt those who are spreading hate on the internet? And do you wish you had the support of others who are doing the same?" So this is basically taking from the official Facebook page of what is the Swedish form of I am here. And so what is counter speech? Counter speech, to use the definition by the Dangerous Speech Project, is defined as any direct response to hateful or harmful speech which seeks to undermine it. And it kind of actually goes back. It is often mentioned in connection with an American lawyer whose name was Louise D. Brandeis, who famously said in the 1920s, "If there be time to expose through discussion the falsehoods and fallacies, to avert the evil by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence." So it kind of, you can already see it has sort of a legal background, and it all goes back to the idea of we can use more and good speech to fight bad speech. We don't need to use censorship. So Susan Benish and her team, they have identified these different types of counter speech. I will show you a few examples of counter speech in just a moment, so it will make a bit more sense then. But there are some key strategies that this research team basically found to be most effective. And that is presenting facts to correct any kind of misstatements or misconceptions that are being made, pointing out hypocrisy or contradictions in a post, warning of offline or online consequences. So that could be saying you can be blocked for this, but also saying something like, your mother might be reading this. Do you really want to post hateful stuff on the internet? Showing affiliation with the victims, denouncing hateful or dangerous speech, of course. Also very important in a lot of cases to, first of all, point out to people you are being hateful, you are using racist or sexist or whichever other form of hate speech. Visual communication is often very useful, especially in the context in combination with humor. So using memes can be very effective in certain contexts. And most importantly, maybe even using an empathetic tone. So not to be aggressive, but to be polite and to be friendly, because otherwise it will just lead to an escalation of the situation and provoke further hateful content. So here are a few examples that I've put together, real life examples of counter speech. You can see the one in the blue box says using language like this is just unnecessarily hurtful towards immigrants. So here, like denouncing it, pointing out you're being hurtful, you're doing something wrong, but not being offensive or rude yourself. The one in the red box is an example of a combination, of course, of an image and humor, maybe, as I mentioned earlier. So here we have a meme of these two birds, and then it's saying, "Please, sir, stop tweeting," kind of a humorous way of saying, "Please stop doing this, please shut up," basically. In the green box at the bottom, remember that those you care about can see this post too. So as I mentioned before, warning of also offline consequences, very personal consequences maybe. And then on the right-hand side, you can also see remaining empathetic. So saying, "I feel sorry for whatever is going on in your life that makes you feel the need to say any of this to a stranger." I hope that things are getting better for you. So not lashing back out at the perpetrator, but actually saying, I'm really sorry that you feel the need to do this. I still wish you the very best. So what can we say about the effectiveness of using counterspeech? Can this actually change the behavior of people? And I've put together the results of a number of different studies that have been done to try and answer this question. And in general, I guess it needs to be noted that it is, first of all, quite difficult to actually measure behavioral change in especially users on the internet. So how do you actually measure whether someone has changed their mind, has changed their perspective and their behavior in relation or in a direct consequence of reading counterspeech? That is unfortunately very difficult to do, but there are a number of studies that are a number of people that are looking into this and trying to find better ways of measuring this. It has been found to be most effective in actually fighting online extremism. So in the context of terrorism, counterspeech has been shown to be quite effective. It has also been found that it seems to be particularly successful in one-to-one conversations or in many-to-one conversations. And it was also found by researchers that organized movements seem to be more effective than striking out on one's own. A very prominent example of, I guess, successful counterspeech is Megan Phelps-Roper, who is now an activist, but she used to be a member of the Westboro Baptist Church. So an actual hate group, officially declared a hate group in the United States of America. But she was, I suppose, converted, if you can say that, on Twitter, because she's always been a very avid user of Twitter, but at some point she started being in contact with this one other user who over a very long period of time kept having conversations and discussions with her about the ideologies that she was spreading and the ideologies that she grew up to believe in. And slowly she started seeing contradictions in these ideologies, and she eventually left the church. And so she said, for example, my life was forever changed by people who took the time and had the patience to learn my story and to share theirs with me. They forsook judgment and came to me with kindness and empathy, and the impact of that decision was huge. So we can see that it can be effective, but I think with this example and other examples as well shows it can be a very lengthy and laborious process, and it really needs a lot of dedication and work to go into this and truly change someone's mind. So that also kind of begs the question of, should that actually be the goal of counterspeech? Should changing someone else's mind or changing a perpetrator's mind particularly be the goal? Who should be the target of counterspeech? And research tends to, and counterspeakers as well, tend to agree that the goal or the target should not be the perpetrator, but should rather be the bystanders, sort of anyone who is following a conversation online, observing it, and might sort of like be on the verge of maybe becoming a perpetrator themselves, but then observing that someone else is using counterspeech and pointing out that something is wrong, is more effective than actually trying to reach a perpetrator. So it has been defined as by Berger, for example, as the so-called movable middle. And the main goal seems to be to kind of encourage others to join the conversation, to be supportive, to show the victim that they're not alone, to make kind of any use of social media features like liking, commenting, reposting, positive comments. And it has been shown in research that this kind of behavior actually increases the number of positive comments that will follow by then other users. But it's often very hard to make that first initial step. But it then has positive effects. It has also been found that the identity of the counterspeaker tends to be really important. So social status, for example, has been identified as a key role. So in a study by Munger, it has been shown in the context of racial hate speech or racist hate speech that a white male user with a high following has the highest likelihood of having an effect on another user that has been racially harassing someone. So that is quite interesting. And then in the context of sectarian hate speech, it also has been found that by Siegel and Badan, that elite endorsed messages that prime common religious identity are the most effective in reducing the spread of sectarian hate speech. And then Munger again, in a more recent study, has found that messages containing moral suasion were more effective at reducing incivility than messages with no moral content. And then finally, a study by Hangartner and others has shown that empathy-based counterspeech against racist hate speech has been shown to be most effective. So this kind of, again, shows, in addition to the social status, which is quite interesting, again, shows the ethical, the moral, and the empathy-based importance of when you're composing kind of a counterspeech response. Yeah, again, in relation to who should be the target of counterspeech, Berger has identified what are called the interpreters. So it would be ideal to target those who see a message and then decide whether or not to spread it further. It has been identified in research on misinformation and how this spreads, for example, that this is the crucial point where it would be really important to intercept, to keep people from spreading false information any further, kind of like break this vicious cycle. There's also been some interesting research on social and discourse norms and how counterspeech affects our norms and our perceptions of our norms. So of course, the behavior of others influences us offline and online. And it has been shown in studies that antisocial behavior can be quite contagious. But at the same time, there are also studies that show that responses to antisocial behavior have an effect as well. So research by Alvarez, Benjumea, and Winter showed, for example, that users are less likely to use hateful speech themselves when they have observed previous hate speech being moderately censored. So not deleted, but kind of like censored a little bit, pointed out, this is not okay. So it does have an effect on other people's perception and their own consequent behaviors. So the last thing I want to mention in this context of like humans performing counterspeech is the concept of collective counterspeech. So of course we can have individuals that are just using social media, using the internet, see something harmful, see something bad being posted and wanting to respond with something positive. But there have also been coordinated group efforts. And the most prominent is probably the Swedish group, or the Swedish equivalent of I am here, so Jag är här, which was originally founded by Mina Dennert. And it now has about 75,000 members whose sole purpose it is to collectively respond to misinformation and hate speech on Facebook. But there have been other examples that kind of followed as well, especially like in the context of what is known as hashtag activism, certain online campaigns like Me Too, Yes All Women, Black Lives Matter. These are all different forms of counterspeech. And then, of course, there are the no hate speech movement, the different groups that have been founded originally by the Council of Europe Youth, of the Europe Youth Department, in 45 countries. I think it's no longer, I'm not sure if it's still active, but they've done a lot of work of posting counterspeech in response to hate speech online. So a lot of these people who are doing this sort of professionally almost say they do it for the wider audience. As I mentioned before, the goal is not necessarily to change someone's mind. And they describe it as having like kind of a rewarding feeling. But it can also be quite a lonely task when you're sitting at your computer and trying to respond to hateful comments on the internet. So understandably, there has also been some research in recent years going into automating counterspeech and of course hate speech detection. And I want to kind of spend the last part of this talk looking at those options a little bit more. So what we kind of need to look at, first of all, when we talk about automating counterspeech potentially is an area called natural language processing, which is kind of an intersection of linguistics and computer science. So basically the idea of using computational methods to process natural human language and large amounts of natural human language. So that is clearly the benefit that we have when using computational methods. This includes things like natural language understanding, but also generation, document summarization, sentiment classification, and so on. You're probably already using some of these, some tools that are based on NLP, such as grammar correction when you're writing a text, harm prediction in emails, fake news detection, or any kind of verbal instructions that you have for Alexa or Siri. So this is an area that is basically vital for any kind of research and developments in the field of automatic hate speech detection and counterspeech generation. So I want to talk on a sort of very abstract and very high level briefly about automated hate speech detection, because that is essentially the first step. If we want to automate counterspeech and the generation of counterspeech on social media, the first step is, of course, to identify hate speech correctly on social media platforms. And so what do we need in order to actually achieve that? So the first step is essentially always the same, and that we need data. We need data to train the system so that it will do a good job of categorizing and identifying harmful speech. So collecting data in most cases means scraping whatever kind of platform we want to, whatever kind of type of data we later want the system to work on. So ideally, if we want to use it on Twitter, we use a lot of Twitter data in order to train the system. Then the data needs to be annotated. It needs to be tagged with different categories. For example, in this context, is a post hate speech or not? And this is, to this day, still largely done by humans. Can be experts, can be non-experts, but the level of detail that is necessary still requires human involvement. Then certain steps are necessary, such like cleaning the data, removing stop words, so any kind of words that do not have, so basically function words like articles, pronouns that might not be necessary to the task at hand. And certain features will be extracted or can be distracted depending. So this is basically for any kind of potential system. It's not all involved in one task. So, but keyword extraction could be important. extracting or identifying the combination of different words that always kind of appear in a different order. Then characters are important, because sometimes in order to avoid a filter, people will use characters in words to avoid this kind of filter. Obviously, kind of sentiment analysis, looking for negatively connotated words. Then in most cases, a kind of deep learning algorithm will be used, or several deep learning algorithms will be used to then classify the data. So the system will be trained on the data that was collected, and it will then try to, as best as possible, apply the categories to the output. So the categories being hate speech or no hate speech, to whatever data it kind of essentially in the end runs on or is applied to. And then in the end, we have evaluation, but I won't go into detail on this anymore because I'm also looking at the time. So as I said, the first step would be we need automatic hate speech detection. And then as a next step, we can think about automatic counterspeech generation, which for which we now use strategies, techniques from natural language generation. So basically automatically producing natural human-like language, which can be writing or speech. And this in principle is fine, but the problem in the context of counterspeech is that the quality of the output is still relatively poor. So I have to point out that this kind of research area is still pretty much in its infancy. And in most cases, the counterspeech responses are quite generic. As you can see in the example here, please refrain from using such language is a counterspeech response, but it is very likely to not be very effective. So any kind of system needs to be able to use diverse or generate diverse responses, and also responses that are relevant to a given hateful comment that it responds to. I have a few more examples here. So you can see on the left, for example, the hate speech comment on top that I will not read out. And then the counterspeech response below. You can see it's quite complex and it's very detailed and nuanced, saying like, I understand that this is extremely scary. And with fear, however, does not really come a rational thinking. So this is a very nuanced reply created by a human that is not as easily just replicated by a machine. And on the right, we can also see different responses to hate speech, and we can see what an expert, for example, would reply to this hateful comment. And then we see a more commonplace response like hate speech is not tolerated. Please review our user policies. Thank you for your cooperation. That is, you can already tell it's a machine telling you this, so you most likely won't care. And then also we can see responses that are simply not relevant. So saying this is racist does not relate to the actual example of hate speech. So as I said, research is still in its infancy, but there have been a few really good studies and suggestions in kind of driving this research forward. And one of these was by, I'm kind of afraid to pronounce the names because I will not get it right, but these researchers basically suggest a method called generate, prune, and select. And so it's kind of like a three-part method that will eventually lead to a more useful and effective kind of counter-speech response being generated or selected by an algorithm. So the first step would be we have a data set that we actually took from social media of real counter-speech responses by people. So that is the data set. Then the next step would be to actually kind of like narrow it down, get rid of any kind of ungrammatical responses, maybe only kind of select the best responses. And then another step would be to kind of select the ones that are most relevant to a given hate speech post. So as I mentioned earlier, pointing out racism is not going to be useful or effective when the hate speech post included a sexist or homophobic hate speech. Yeah, so there are still a number of issues that exist in this context, and those basically relate to both the annotation of the data and also the availability of different data sets. So as I mentioned earlier, lots of the annotation is still being done by humans. That is incredibly time consuming and laborious. It is also, of course, subjective what constitutes effective counterspeech. And there are, of course, a wide range of communicative strategies that we can use and that different people will use. So how to automate that, how to use generally acceptable examples of counterspeech is a difficult question to answer. And then availability of data sets. So there are still very few really big and qualitatively high data sets of actual counterspeech. This is in part due to the fact that we need whole conversations. We cannot just simply use one post and take that out of context. We will need to follow a discussion between people. And one of the biggest problems, as with all language approaches, is that most data sets are in English. One exception being the Conan dataset by Chung and colleagues, which was published in 2019. This is one of the few multilingual datasets that exists, available in both in English, French, and Italian. And they also used kind of labeling by experts. So these were actually people working for NGOs kind of annotating the data, which is of course not necessarily feasible for any kind of context. Okay, and finally, so there are still some problems that need to be solved, but what about the question in general, should we automate counterspeech? And I would say yes, especially in the context of assisting experts and any kind of amateur counterspeakers online. So I think essentially humans are still doing a really good job at producing effective counterspeech, but I think technology can be a significant advantage in spreading counterspeech maybe, and also potentially helping people to overcome this initial hurdle of responding to a hateful comment. And this is where something like a semi-automated counterspeech generator could come in, that kind of prompts people to produce counterspeech. So when given the task, for example, to respond to racist hate speech, it can kind of make suggestions how to respond, similar to the Smart Compose function or reply suggestions that you get in Microsoft Office. And so, yeah, this can be possible in form of an app, a browser extension, a web interface to help people, as I said earlier, to kind of help overcome this initial hurdle. Yeah, I'm running significantly out of time. I think I will just leave or stop here so that we can still, that I can still answer some questions. So thank you very much, first of all, for listening.